Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thanks, everyone. I'm truly delighted to be here this evening. And tonight, I'm going to start off by spending just a few minutes answering the question that both Sarah and I were given to talk a little bit about our worldview. And the question that we were asked is the following: how would you describe your worldview, and how did your life journey lead you to this worldview? So I would describe my worldview as one that is based on the concept of equality. And by equality, I mean that we are all of equal worth. So this concept is based on a biblical definition of equality, in the sense that I believe that we are all made in the image of God, which inherently gives us equal status, in the sense that we are all of equal worth, and that we have equal worth regardless of how much we know, so this worth cannot be attained, regardless of how much we have, so this worth cannot be bought, or regardless of what we do, so this worth cannot be earned. So we all have equal status, and yet, so in principle, I think that this concept of equality is rather simple, and yet in practice, it is extremely challenging to carry out because of the fact that everything in us wants to avoid treating others as equals, as inherently worth equally. So we learned this from a very early age. For example, I have two boys, one that is 6 years old and the other is 8 years old. And my younger son frequently likes to ask me, which one of the two do I love the most? In fact, I kid you not, he asked me this last night. And I like to tell him that that is like asking me, which of my two eyes do I love the most, right? As a parent, this is a ridiculous question. And in fact, I believe that God gave us parenthood to give us a glimpse into how he feels about us. But so as a parent, this is a rather ridiculous question, and yet we all do this, grown-ups and children alike. We all want to know two things. We want to, first of all, we want to have a higher status than others, and we want to know what our status is relative to others. In fact, since I'm in academia, my husband calls this practice that I'm about to describe academic butt sniffing. You're a dog person, so you know exactly what I mean. So what happens is, if you've attended any academic conferences, if this information is not already on our name tags, the first thing that we want to do is we want to know everyone's academic rank and institutional affiliation. This affects how we treat each other. In fact, recently I attended a conference that I don't normally attend. It's at least sociologists don't normally attend this conference. It's the AEFP, the Association for Education, Finance, and Policy. And I attended a plenary session where I sat at a table surrounded by people that I did not know. And it turns out when I sat down and introduced myself and started talking to them, I sat at a table full of grad students. And at one point in the conversation, one of the students turned to me and asked how close I was to finishing my dissertation. No big deal, but so actually I was flattered, right? Because that meant she thought I looked young. So I was very flattered by the question, but I told her I'm not a student. And the following question was, well, how close are you to getting tenure? And so then when I explained to her that I was a professor, that they were visibly disturbed, and that completely altered our conversation, right? So these are perhaps silly examples, but the consequences are much more serious when it comes to the implications of not seeing each other as equals, as having equal worth. We have a very long history of not treating each other as having equal worth, and we have created very powerful social and economic structures that teach us to believe in a lie. They teach us to believe in a lie that we are not inherently of equal worth. And we learned this at a very young age. There are, the famous doll experiments. You're a psychologist. I'm sure you're familiar with the famous doll experiments where young children, they put a black doll and a white doll in front of children, and they ask the children to identify the bad doll. And they systematically choose the black doll. And when they ask the children to identify the nice doll, they systematically choose the white doll. And I was particularly, it broke my heart when I saw a video of a young black girl who was then asked to identify the doll that looked like her. We learn, whether or not we're explicitly taught this, we function in a society where we learn from a very young age, we learn to believe in this lie, that we are inherently not equal. And we have set up social and economic structures that function in this way. Take property values as another example, right? And we, even if we would like to believe that we are not racist, but we have to acknowledge the fact that we function in a racist system, in a racist economic structure. Did you know that neighborhoods, for example, our property values are affected by the racial and ethnic composition of our neighborhoods? There is a premium on having white neighbors. That is a racist economic structure that we function in, right? And so we have created these systems that teach us this lie, that we are not inherently of equal worth. That is why it is very important to me to look to this concept that I started off with, the concept of equality is meaning having equal worth. So in the Bible, there are some descriptions of equality that I think are extremely important to us. One example, if I may turn to it. We like to maintain the status quo in these systems because we don't truly believe that we are all of equal worth. Yet the Bible teaches us that equality means that we have equal worth in the eyes of God and that we have a responsibility to promote equality, to produce it. So one example is one passage that says, "Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard pressed, but that there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what you need. The goal is equality, as it is written, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little." This illustration really speaks to me because I have experienced extremes in the economic distribution. I have experienced being both in the lower 10% of the economic distribution to the top 10% of the economic distribution. I have experienced what it is like to have great need. I have also experienced great abundance. I have experienced the joy of giving. I have also experienced others' generosity. So when I was in 6th grade, some members of our church just showed up at my house, unannounced, walked in, went straight to the refrigerator and started filling it with groceries. That experience changed my life. Not necessarily because of the food that they brought, but because of the generosity that they demonstrated. And I will never forget that. I also, at a very young age, was exposed to the concept of injustice. I grew up in poverty. My mother had an 8th grade education. My father had a 3rd grade education. And between them, they had 12 children. Then they were separated before the age of 5. And my mother was left to raise all those children on her own. She worked multiple jobs, night shifts, had no benefits, no child support. Things were really rough for us at home. But the thing that bothered me the most was the fact that she worked so hard for so little. And it wasn't until later that I identified that as an injustice. But I knew from a very young age that that was just wrong. So when I was about 12 years old, I went through a time of heightened sensitivity to my circumstances. And I suppose it was the onset of adolescence, but I longed more than anything else, despite our poverty, I longed for a father. And on a particularly bad day, I remember that I locked myself in the room and threw myself on the floor and began to cry because I felt cheated. And in this very low moment, I felt God's presence in a new way. I felt God telling me that He was my Father, right? And I realized at that moment that I already had what I had been longing for so much. In this moment, I realized that I had a Father who loved me and who would take care of me. And I found a lot of comfort in that phrase of having a Father that loved me. So I am no longer poor, and I've had the privilege of marrying a wonderful man who has been a really loving father to my children. But I relive my childhood emotions whenever I see people in need, especially children in need. And I carry a wound that has led to a deep desire to work toward creating systems that treat children equally, that value children equally, systems that provide not only for their current needs, but also their future needs. And I believe that if we adopt this concept of equality, of actually seeing people as having equal worth, that will affect what we do, and that this world would be radically different. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So I'm not sure how to balance my microphone and my notes and all this, but I'll do my best. First of all, thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be discussing with Dr. Turley here and Dr. Vigil. I'm by far the least qualified member of this panel, so thank you very much for listening to me. I'd like to start off just talking to you guys a little bit about sort of my life journey and how I ended up where I am with essentially the economist's worldview. And then I'd like to apply the economist's worldview to the question that we're talking about today. Intolerance, injustice, and inequality. Is God necessary? And so trying to relate those two together. So, to start off with, I was raised very Catholic. To give you an idea, I got kicked out of high school, my sophomore year of high school, for lighting off fireworks in the bathroom. And I got sent on an Opus Dei retreat. It didn't solve the problem, but I didn't light off any more fireworks, so it was okay. You know, when I was growing up, you know, we had Stations of the Cross in our house. We would say the Stations of the Cross every night during Lent as a family. I mean, I'm not going to sing, but, you know, I know all those Latin songs and so forth. And so it was really this very rich religious upbringing. I mean, I grew up wanting to be a nun. Actually, I really hoped to be Joan of Arc. I kept waiting for God to show up and have me lead his armies on his behalf and so forth. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Adolescence happened. And, you know, going through middle school, early high school, and so forth, I was bullied a lot, I prayed a lot, and I didn't ever get a response, positive or negative. I just didn't hear anything back. And so eventually, as I moved into college and my life started improving and so forth, and I still didn't hear any voice of God or any particular influence of God, and it seemed to be getting better on its own, so I just kind of gave up on the idea of God having an influence in my life. And that's not to say that I don't think that God can be an incredibly positive influence in many, many people's lives. Just for me, if you don't believe, it's not like it's something you can just turn on or turn off. And so, after college, I did a bunch of jobs and so forth, but probably the most formative thing for me has been studying economics, because it really gives you a framework of the world, a way to sort of prioritize what we want to achieve as a society subject to scarcity constraints. Because the resources in this world are limited. There's no way we can get around that. It would be great if everybody could have top-of-the-line health care, but we can't afford that as a society. So what are we going to do? Are we going to ration it? Are we going to prevent wealthy people from getting the top-of-the-line health care? Are we going to ensure a basic level of health care for everybody in our society? These are all very important questions. And so to give you just a little bit more of an idea of how I apply my logic, fact-based view of the world, I want to talk a little bit more about whether God is necessary for tolerance, injustice, and equality. So first of all, let's distinguish between necessity and sufficiency. So sufficiency, if God, then we will be just, tolerant, and equal, or we will be people who value justice and tolerance and equality. On the other hand, necessity suggests if we're just, tolerant, and equal, then we must believe in God. I like to think that I at least am an example of at least some of that. I do care about justice, tolerance, and equality. And I'm wondering, are there any agnostic atheists in this room who are willing to raise their hand and say they care about justice, tolerance, and equality? We got a couple others. So clearly we have just disproven the premise of this, talk to some extent, using basically simple logic in that God is not necessary to care about tolerance, inequality, and justice. Another aspect of this, the premise of this talk, is what do we even mean by God? Are we talking about a Christian God? Are we talking about existence of God? Are we talking about belief in God? This is very ambiguous, and there's really a lot of different questions we could be answering here today. I'm going to focus on a Christian God and belief in God, just to simplify things. And I want to dig into a little bit further into sort of what we're talking about with tolerance, justice, and equality. So tolerance. Is more tolerance always better? So think, public urination. Do we want to tolerate public urination? First, that's unjust to women, but apart from that issue, there's certain things that we as a society have decided that the negative consequences of people behaving in that way outweigh the positive benefits to those individuals. You could think of an even more extreme example, pedophilia. Clearly, the benefits to the pedophiles do not outweigh their costs to society. And so we may not want to be completely tolerant of everything. When we come to equality, inequality can actually be a very motivating force. It's part of the reason that our economy functions the way it does. That said, and I quote Larry Summers, who is not by any knowledge of mine particularly God-fearing or liberal or anything like that, he said that he believes the current inequality in our economy is fundamentally destabilizing. And the problem here is that a certain level of inequality can provide incentives for people to try to improve their education, improve the amount, their jobs, and so forth. At some point, though, if we end up in a situation where the inequality is so severe that the people at the bottom have no hope of ever moving up, then we've reached a point where our society can't progress. Because if you have no hope, then you have no reason to abide by society's rules, whether they're based in Christianity or something else, and that's going to be fundamentally destabilizing. The last component of the question is justice. I have a hard time arguing that a more just society would be worse. But again, there might be some incentives you could think of, in terms of justice. For example, I always think back to college, and I remember some of my friends, they smoked pot in college, and a couple of them got caught. And the kids who were poor, they dropped out of school. The kids who are rich, their parents hired them lawyers and they didn't miss a beat. I don't think that's fair. I think that is incredibly unjust. And I think we need to make sure that people are treated equally. Whether or not that comes from some sort of idea of people being created inherently equal, I think that we as a society have decided that we want to treat people equally. So let's reframe the question. So is a Christian belief in God necessary to care about decreasing injustice and intolerance and inequality? Clearly the answer is no. And I just want to sort of quickly summarize my worldview before I give the mic back. My worldview is I review the facts. I try to determine what society's goals are. What are we striving to achieve here? Do we want absolute tolerance? Maybe not. And then act in a way to achieve those goals, provide the information necessary to achieve those goals. And I think that the best way for ensuring justice, tolerance, and equality is to bring everybody to the table, God-fearing and godless alike. And that's the best way to avoid discrimination and prejudice in our decision-making process. Thank you.
Thank you. So Dr. Turley, I'm going to just let you respond to Sarah directly. So she obviously seems like a very just, concerned citizen in our society. And the question is, why does one need to be a Christian to be a good person? How does Christianity offer a worldview that facilitates justice and equality above and beyond alternative perspectives?
So I actually, I don't think that you need to be a Christian to put it in your words, to be a good person, quote unquote. I don't think that you need to be a Christian in order to do great things toward equality and justice even. But what I do believe is that the principles behind equality and justice, first of all, a lot of the things that we have in society today are based off of those Christian principles, whether or not it's recognized. But the Bible is, of course, a very ancient text, and that the concept itself of equality, the concept of just the idea of challenging gender status and challenging poverty and challenging all those things, we have examples of that in the Bible. And so I think that a lot of the principles that are applied today that we have developed in our societies, they actually have Christian roots. But there are many examples of wonderful things that have been done by non-Christians. So I don't think that I would not make that claim that you need to be a Christian in order to do good things. However, having said that, I do believe that the idea of Christianity is that, I'm not sure that we should be comparing, I guess I should say, I'm not sure that's the right question. I don't think that we should be comparing Christians to non-Christians because, there are many examples of non-Christians doing wonderful things, and there are also many, many examples of Christians doing truly horrible things, right? And we, as Christians, must acknowledge that. We have caused a lot of harm, right? So because we have many examples of, many counterexamples, what I think is the more appropriate comparison from a Christian perspective is that we should, when we ask about Christianity, we should be comparing Christians at time 1 to Christians at time 2, meaning that as a believer, or I as a believer, believe that my faith is a faith journey, and I believe that we are in a process of transformation, and that I need to learn to I want to learn to be more like God in the sense of trying to apply those principles that some of the examples of which that I mentioned from the Bible, that I think many of us have done a horrible job of applying, and then we bring in our own cultural lenses and we warp and twist those principles. So if we were to then go back to the heart of those principles of equality and justice, it's very important, I think, to base our definitions on something that is beyond us. because of the cultural lenses that I mentioned, and because of, for example, what the theologian Miroslav Volf calls justice against justice, right? That we have many examples of different concepts of justice that are in direct contradiction to one another, right? So for that reason, I think it is very helpful to base our definitions of justice and equality on something that is beyond us.
So from your perspective, do you see Christianity as making a choice between the dichotomy of fostering our own potential versus facilitating the potential of other folks? How do you make sense of that? It seems like we have the inherent kind of biological disposition to want to kind of excel as individuals, to stand out, to pronounce our uniqueness and so forth. And at least what I'm hearing from your perspective is that Christianity seems to foster pro-social motivations.
Well, I think it's a bad idea to just focus on the individual level. And unfortunately, we do put a lot of emphasis on the individual level, and many Christians do that too. But I think the Bible says that God is in the process of making things right in this world, and that refers to not just what's going on at the individual level, but it refers to our structures, our systems, that those also need to be made right. And that's why I think it's rather dangerous to focus on the individual level alone. I think that we need to focus a lot more on what is happening at the structural level. And I think that that's also biblical, actually, that we need to have concern for others even more so than the concern for ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Stiff, question for you as well. So the question is, how can we rely on people to make just decisions who don't directly benefit economically by doing so?
I don't remember this being one of the questions on the list. No, I think that's a very reasonable question, and I sort of would like to flip it around in a sense. In how can we rely on people's faith to make them do good things? Like, can we really rely on faith alone? I would argue you can't, and that you need to have the right incentives in place in order for people to do what we want them to do as a society, what we have determined collectively by bringing everybody to the table, what we have decided we want to happen. Those may be financial incentives. Those could be, I work in the context of organ transplantation. There's all sorts of different reciprocal relationships there. You have people donating their organs without expecting to get anything in response, and we as a society have decided they are not allowed to get anything in response. So I think that, and I'm sure if you go through all the organ donors, you're not going to find that they're only Christians. You're going to find people of all sorts of different faiths. You're going to find people who don't even believe in God. And so I think that, while I would agree with Dr. Turley that Christianity can form a very solid basis for how you view right and wrong, and that our society has grown up with a lot of those beliefs, and that those may be sort of underlying a lot of our subconscious decisions, I do not think that on an individual basis that we need to rely on God to motivate our decisions. I think we can create the right incentives. I think when you think about interacting with people, I mean, most of us try to be nice to other people. Well, you could say, oh, that's selfish, because we realize that if we're nice to other people, they're generally nice to us. I mean, there's a lot of sort of societal structures that help ensure these sort of pro-social behaviors beyond just believing in God. And sort of lastly, just this is sort of getting a little away from the mind, but relating back to what Dr. Turley was saying about sort of the society versus the individual. The problem I see with that is the society is still made up of the individuals acting arguably in their own self-interest. And so I think we do need to focus on getting at the micro level, figuring out how to motivate people to make them care about their communities, to make them want to contribute to their communities, and to establishing a more egalitarian society.
So Dr. Stith, you alluded to the possibility that we're endowed with biologically moral systems that might be evidenced by universal ideals of moral relevance around the world.
Are you referring to that?
No.
Dr. Stitt.
No. So I'd like you to comment on, how does Christianity or having faith facilitate or supplement a presumed biological disposition to do well to other folks? Does it enhance the individual's life or capability of doing that in some way?
So are you asking, like, I guess I'm not totally sure I understand.
So
what you're
my
trying to
question
get
is, you know, if we're endowed with a biological disposition, regardless of the cultural artifacts that we've been exposed to throughout our life, does Christianity supplement that, or does it facilitate that? Does it allow us to potentiate this moral relevance that seems to be expressed regardless of what we've been taught by our parents?
So, because I'm not sure I would identify or label it as a biological disposition, so that's probably where you threw me. But I would say that we are, if anything, I would say we have a biological disposition not to do that, right? Because I was giving the example of, you know, how, you know, even my children at a very young age, like they just want to, they're all about this status, and we want, I don't think that we want to view others as equals. I think actually the opposite. I think that, I'm saying I don't think that we want to do that, and that's precisely why I think that Christianity can give us those principles to act differently than what we want to do, right? Because, so in a sense, I agree with part of what you're saying about how individuals are, you know, we're kind of selfish, and we want to, and sometimes not necessarily, I don't mean in a judgmental sort of way, right? Like as a parent, you know, study educational inequality, I understand the tension that many parents face when they say, I want to do what's best for my child, as opposed to like, and sometimes that contradicts what's best for society, right? So I'm not saying that in a sort of judgmental way that like, how could a parent do that? Well, of course, a parent wants to do what's best for their child and not necessarily look out for the well-being of other people's children. That, you know, that kind of attention is precisely the kind of situation where I would say that's where some Christian principles of equality and justice come into play. These are not easy things to do. They're very, very challenging, and I think that's probably why so many Christians don't actually live up to that. They don't follow those principles, but they're very clearly in the Bible that we need to look out for people in need. And I think that if you apply that to the realm of education, that means that we need to look out for the educational well-being of all children. And so just because I, you know, am a privileged parent and can afford to provide certain educational resources for my own children, that does not mean that I don't have a responsibility to help other people's children too, right?
Sure. So you mentioned some of the societal benefits by engaging in Christianity and Christian types of behaviors. You know, just in a quick review of some of the literature out there on faith and medical issues, it seems very clear that folks that abide by an ideal of faith tend to do better in terms of their physical health. So is that something that we should be promoting because it has obvious medical benefits, or is there ways that we could achieve those benefits through some other means?
Well, to start off with, I would really have to see those articles to assess them. Economics tends to be much more conservative than most other fields in terms of trying to make sure we find nothing. So one has to be a little careful with those studies that it's not a selection effect. It's not that, for example, people who are religious tend to have other healthy habits that therefore influence their outcomes. That said, I think that probably if you're, you know, facing death and you have a strong belief of God, that can provide strength for you, much in the same way that having a strong sense of family, of responsibility to your community could also give you that same additional boost in terms of your recovery. Now, if you're a totally miserable person, I mean, there are definitely studies that show that depression has horrible negative health consequences, and that's not even, you know, talking about people who are dying. We're just talking about people who are living, sort of. So I think there absolutely could be some truth to that. I don't think that necessarily means that we can all start believing in God. I mean, I guess that kind of comes back to the thing is, yes, that's really nice that people who believe in God, if we assume it's not a selection effect, that they could have better outcomes. But what do you do for someone like me who doesn't believe in God? I mean, I can't just turn it on.
So there's a lot of folks that believe that a belief in faith is a byproduct of our cognitive evolution. So it's just another example of how we simulate information and try to make sense of information in some kind of logical way. So the question is, if we have the tendency to engage in faithful beliefs after certain types of life experiences, and if it's possible to induce these thoughts and these cogitations and these processes irrespective of faith, why would we need faith? Or perhaps let me frame the question this way. So a lot of folks do believe that faith is a byproduct of cognitive evolution. Why do you think that our appreciation of faith is distinct from other types of cognitive or mental abilities or ways that we think about the world? Why is faith, maybe personally for you, something that's truly distinct from, for example, affiliating with a coalition or being part of a sports fan base or affiliating with other types of group types of behaviors like that? How is faith distinct from those other types of human behaviors?
That's a great question. I would say that one issue or one realm, I guess I'll pick up on the personal aspect. One area where my faith has affected my work, apart from, of course, I'm a scientist, I'm a social scientist. I have to also rely on logic and on, we both care, we talked at dinner beforehand, and so we both care about causality. I mean, we both care about these kinds of things. And yet, even as a scientist, I have to admit that there is so much that I don't know, so much that I don't understand. And as a Christian, I am far from perfect. I don't have all the answers. And even as I stated earlier about, I'm trying to understand the biblical concept of equality and justice, and these principles are very important to me. And yet, I have to approach with humility. Because I don't understand completely, and it's in the same way that I approach my scientific research, right? I have to approach it with some humility in that there's no such thing as a perfect research project. All our research has lots of limitations, and especially in the work that I do working with the Houston Independent School District, my work is not just being published in some academic journal. It's actually being used by district leaders and being used to inform decisions that affect over 200,000 children. That freaks me out, right? Because that puts a lot more pressure on me providing them with good, rigorous research. And so what I find myself doing often is coming to them with, saying, okay, this is where the evidence is pointing, but these are the limitations, and it makes, and it's just, so we have to approach this with some, an element of humility, because I don't understand, there's a lot that I don't understand, so I'm not sure that I'm completely addressing the heart of your question, but I guess what I'm saying is that that's where the element of faith comes in, because I'm a scientist and there's a lot that I am trying to understand. That's actually the heart of the scientist, right? We're trying to understand things. We have a heart of inquiry, right? And yet it seems like the more I learn, the more questions I have, and the more I realize that there is so much that we don't understand, and that is where the element of faith comes in that we don't, we don't understand everything, and there are a lot of things that I feel like we cannot explain through science, And I'm saying this, as a scientist. There's a lot that we cannot explain through science that I believe we can explain through faith.
What would be some examples?
Great question. One quick example, how two invisible cells can come together and start a chemical reaction inside of me, right, to produce a life. We cannot explain that. What drives that chemical reaction? Like, what causes a tiny seed that's seemingly dead, right, to grow into a giant tree full of life? Something that is dead that becomes life. It's interesting that we're talking about this in this way during Holy Week, right? Like this, how do you understand that? How do you fully grasp that? How can this thing just grow inside of me? And, to me, and even people that know a lot more about this than I do in terms of the details of the science behind it, like what actually drives that chemical reaction to produce exactly the sequencing, right? Everything has to happen in a certain way, very complex process. To me, it's like, how can you not believe in God when you see that?
Thank you. So I'd actually like to take the time to play the devil's advocate again. So I mentioned that, it seems as though around the world, folks seem to have a propensity to at least abide by universal morals. We don't hurt small objects, we don't steal, we try to reciprocate this and that. I find it interesting that faith has emerged all over the world, across regions, across historical contexts, in ways that we would presume would meet the criteria for biological adaptation, like our thumbs, the way that we think about things, and so forth. These are the criteria that we assume are the derivatives of biology and evolution. So there seems to be a universality of an appreciation of faith across time and regions. So that brings up the question of, if folks aren't abiding by the same type of good, is there an absolute good out there? So the specific question is, how do you know what good is?
Okay, there was a lot in that. So I think that it is a very interesting point, the way that faith has sort of exists around the world, and so many of the values are so similar across religions. I think that some of that comes from the innate human sort of curiosity, the desire to explain things. Because you could argue that, yes, we may not understand every aspect of the whole conception and so forth, but if you look back to like what we understood 1,000 years ago about birth and so forth, we've made huge strides. And so I don't see that we're not going to figure out exactly why that happens. And I actually am surprised to hear we haven't already. I don't know enough about sort of these sort of neonatology and so forth. So, but I think that in terms of sort of this absolute versus relative truth, which actually, interestingly enough, was a dinner table conversation growing up. My father is a PhD in religious studies. But there are absolute truths. 2 + 2 is 4. I know some of my students might try to argue with me about that, but really, 2 + 2 is 4. But there are other things that it seems like really are a creation of our society. The values that we have in terms of, for example, in this country, we have the death penalty. Most European countries, if not all of them, feel that that's barbaric. In fact, they've banned manufacturers from selling drugs that are used in executions. So clearly, whether or not the government should be able to kill people, it's a relative to the society we live in. I mean, some of us might argue, it is an absolute truth because our society is right and the other societies are wrong. But I would argue that it's relative in the sense that different societies come up with different beliefs about what is right, what is wrong, what is good, and what that society wants to promote. And it's based on the people in that society. And the more that you can bring equal representation of all the different members of society, the better we're going to be able to have sort of a universal sense of good that doesn't just benefit a few.
So Dr. Stith, I heard your worldview is based on economics and the relative incentives that we have to benefit by engaging in equal practices with others. So what would cause you to believe in God? What would cause you to reverse your views, your worldviews perhaps, and abide by some ideal of faith?
Well, I mean, if like with doubting Thomas, Jesus appeared in front of me and let me shove my fingers into the wound from the sword where they checked to see if he was, or the spear where they checked to see if he was dead, that would probably convince me. Or you can think about the miracle of, I think it was Luciano, where the bread and wine literally changed into the body and blood of Christ. You know, something like that would probably convince me. But I have to say the day-to-day is not really convincing me.
I could ask you the same question. So what type of experience might you encounter that would cause you to change your worldview and to lose faith in God?
So I would actually say that, so part of Christianity means being open to change, right? So I, unlike some of the dogmatic experiences that you've had, that I'm sorry for that, actually, I really am.
They were enriching.
I think I don't think Christians should be dogmatic in that way. I don't think that's appropriate. I think that part of being a Christian means that we have to be open to change. We have to be humble. We have to acknowledge that we, don't have all the answers, as I mentioned earlier. So maybe this is a slightly different angle than what you're asking about. But my faith has already changed in some pretty dramatic ways. In as I mentioned to you earlier, like I used to be a rule follower, and now I would consider myself more of a God follower. And I think it's dangerous to be a rule follower and to think that you're better than other people because you follow this checklist of rules, and that's. So I've changed in many ways, and I expect to continue to change. So I am open to change, but kind of like what you said, I kind of doubt that would happen in terms of like something. I kind of doubt that something would change my beliefs in the other direction, meaning that I would like suddenly stop believing in God. But having said that, I mean. My faith is challenged on a regular basis. Just last month, I went to Israel and visited the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. If that doesn't challenge your faith, in the sense that how could God let this happen? I kept asking myself that question, and there are a lot of things that I see, have seen. And that we have to ask ourselves these hard questions. So I grapple with my faith, but I also think that's part of the journey that I talked about earlier.
Thank you very much. So that's going to conclude the discussion part of our forum here. I'd like to remind everybody that we have refreshments after the reception. I'm now going to entertain some of the excellent questions that you guys have brought forth. So I want to follow up with what you were just saying. So, a lot of folks wrestle with the idea of, how could God let bad things happen? I hear it all the time around me. Some folks think about things a little bit differently. So this specific question is, does your God treat people equally around the world? How could he let the Holocaust occur?
Oh, that's interesting that I just mentioned that. I hadn't seen the question.
I'm improvising.
Oh, you're adding that. Oh, they asked that. In all honesty, like I said, I don't have the answers. There are a lot of things that have happened in our history and that are happening currently that are horrible. There are horrible things that I have experienced personally. But what I have found, like when I mentioned earlier about the experience that I had in my childhood, my circumstances did not change, right? When I felt that God spoke to me, my circumstances did not change for a long time. The pain did not go away. And yet, I learned to rely on God, and that was a source of comfort for me to get through it. And so while I don't claim to understand why horrible things happen, I have to admit that some of the horrible things that I have experienced, at least, I feel like I have learned to rely more on God through those experiences. And that, in fact, God is my hope in many ways, in terms of my hope in not just bringing about justice to a particular situation, but bringing about world transformation, right? Making this world right. That hope comes from my faith in God.
Really good. I've heard other folks talk about how maybe God doesn't facilitate or allow you to experience suffering, but helps you get through it. So it's a different perspective, not causing the suffering, but kind of, facilitating the progress through it. So I have a similar question from the audience for you, Dr. Stith. So what kind of interaction with God would lead you to believe that you're actually hearing an audible voice? Outside of a visual representation and something that you could capture on a videotape like this, what do you think would be the signs that you could possibly experience at some point in your life?
Well, I think I answered this a little bit in the last question. I consider myself an agnostic, not an atheist, in part because I do believe there's a lot I don't understand about this world, and I'm completely obsessed with hiking, and I go off into the mountains, and it's just so beautiful, and they're just, how did something so beautiful get created? Well, we have a lot of science that helps explain a lot of it, but that's the whole point of being a scientist and doing research, is to find out more. There's always more to discover and so forth, and so there's always going to be something unknown. In terms of believing, I think it's really honestly somewhat unequal and unjust that doubting Thomas got to see Jesus, and I fall into the class of blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. So I think it's sort of just, basically it would have to be something pretty impressive before I would be able to change my mind. That said, I think it's an interesting note that insurance policies do not cover acts of God. They specifically state that.
Yeah.
So maybe there are acts of God out there.
Can I quickly respond to her comment, which I think, wow, that was a good one. What was the comment that you made right before that? Right before the acts of God?
The blessed are those who have not seen.
Oh, thank you, yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to that, interestingly, there were a lot of people, there are examples in the Bible of people who did interact face-to-face with Jesus and still didn't believe. So it doesn't necessarily guarantee, if you were to experience something, so it's not about the experience in and of itself. You might be thinking oh, well, why didn't I get to experience X or Y or Z? But actually it doesn't necessarily guarantee that would do it, right? Because there were people that
But if God wanted
did.
it to, couldn't it do it?
So I'm just saying it's something else. I'm just saying it's something, I think. I'm just speculating here because like I said earlier, I really don't know the answer to this. I don't want me to come across as I know the answer. I don't. I'm just speculating, but I'm just saying that interestingly, there are people in the Bible that interacted face-to-face with Jesus and still didn't believe. Right.
So along those lines, how do you account for that? How do you account for the possibility that God doesn't seem to be able to reach everybody? And, oftentimes people vacillate back and forth, and their faith becomes strengthened or weakened at different points in their life.
That's a good point. We are getting into the hard questions. I like this. Yeah, I am not sure, right? I want to start off with that before I say anything else. I am not sure, but it does seem to me that God reaches out in many different ways to people. God does seem to come after people, and sometimes they respond, and sometimes they don't. And I'm not sure. And I'm not saying that, like in your example, I don't, that you're like ignoring God or whatever. I don't mean to imply that. But I do think that sometimes people respond in different ways, and maybe you have a psychological explanation for that, I don't know. But I do believe that God pursues us, and that sometimes we see it and respond to it, and sometimes we don't. And that's the part where I don't think I have an explanation for you about why that is.
My explanations are very long-winded. So thank you very much. So one last question for you, Dr. Stith. Without God, again, it is kind of coming back to the point, the thesis of our forum here. What is the standard for equality, tolerance, and injustice? How could we endow that in folks? How could we facilitate that if there's no objective means by which we could all agree on what it is, or if it is, in fact, culturally defined?
I think that's a very good question as well. And this kind of goes back to some thoughts I was having when Dr. Turley was doing her initial remarks, and that is, what do we mean by equality? Even in the God sense, God created us all equal. What does that mean? I don't know that has any more sort of validity as an argument than just saying we all should have equal opportunity or we all should have equal outcomes. Equality is a very nebulous concept. And just in terms of how we're going to define it, I think that is really going to come down to a cultural issue, to a society coming together, ideally with as many parties as possible, to decide what do we care about? What is just in our society? What level of equality do we want to ensure? Should everybody have access to the highest in healthcare? Should everybody have access to a basic level of healthcare, when that's probably all we're going to be able to afford anyway? When it comes to tolerance, again, I think that's a very questionable term. I think there are a lot of behaviors we don't want to be tolerant of. And so again, we can get into semantics. Are people equal? What exactly does that mean? To me, that means when I'm in a classroom, I try to make sure that all my students have the opportunity to learn the information I'm giving them. Some of them may require more effort on my part than other students. Is that equal? I'm giving them unequal benefits in the education process, yet I'm trying to ensure that they have the same opportunities as other people. So I think it's far too complex to really just distill into a single definition.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that relying on the consensus within a society would be most appropriate for the societal needs. Let me just open it up to the crowd again one last time. If you guys have a question?
Hi there, my name is Lori Manuel. I'm a researcher over at India Labs as well as a doctoral candidate here at UNN. And the question I had was, so both of your academic disciplines are great. They incorporate a global perspective. We also have the benefit of being here at a university, as well as in a culture where injustice and intolerance are bad, but we can still have forums like this without fear of any type of fatal consequence. But for other parts of the world, we've heard a lot about the Middle East and just this morning about Kenya, where intolerance and injustice and prejudice is a desperate situation with very fatal consequences. So I was wondering from both of the panelists how your worldview would address that, interpret that, and most importantly, resolve that.
You want to go first? All right.
So I think that also brings to question another way to interpret the title of this talk. Is God necessary for intolerance, injustice, and inequality? When you're talking about the Middle East, much of what's going on over there is done, at least hypothetically, in the name of God. So I'm not sure God is going to resolve that problem. And as we know from the Crusades, that wasn't real successful either going in and trying to bring in our Western values and so forth. Again, I think that giving people the opportunity to make better lives for themselves, to have some sort of upward mobility, where there's some hope that outweighs the benefits of blowing yourself up and getting 72 virgins in the afterlife. I mean, you have to have a functioning economy in order for people to have a reason to live. If everything's just chaos, then not only are our economic incentives not going to work, but chances are our basic faith in God is going to be severely questioned and is not going to be sufficient to ensure an equal, tolerant society.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, as I mentioned briefly earlier, I went to Israel last month. But I spent time in both Israeli territory and Palestinian territory, shared meals with Muslim and Christian Palestinians, shared meals with Orthodox Jewish families, spent time in the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, as I mentioned earlier, and also spent time in the refugee camps in the West Bank. Whose justice is right? From an outsider's perspective, it looks to me like a lot of groups, multiple groups, have a legitimate claim on the same piece of land. And this has caused a lot of pain and suffering for generations. And a lot of it, as you mentioned, is, in the name of God, right? And so I recognize that, and I saw it firsthand recently, and I grappled with that question. It really bothered me that, it's just, any way you look at it, like, it's injustice, injustice, injustice. And that's actually one reason why, when I said earlier, like, I feel like our definition of justice must be based on something beyond us. And I know that some of those groups have attempted to do that, but I actually think that they've done in many cases, and of course Christians included, perhaps Christians at the forefront in many ways, have done a poor job of truly understanding those concepts and truly applying them well. And so that's actually why I think it's so important for us to take a look at the biblical concepts, because it can be very dangerous if we run around applying these principles in ways that focus on how these things might benefit us, as opposed to focusing on others, and really taking it one step further in the sense that, Jesus tells us to love our enemies. If we tried to apply that, this world would be very different. If we truly tried to love our enemies, this world would be very different.
I think something that everybody could agree on, and that is that the purpose of life is to live a life of purpose. So it's up to you to find your own purpose. Thank you very much.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.